Hi, my name is Joseph Miscamara, and I'm currently in Cape Town for the semester where I live in OBS and I have to navigate a whole new city with a different life than what I'm used to. In this video, I'm going to try and dissect my daily commutes and break it down in terms of geographical, social, and practical concepts in order to learn more about how my life is shaped by mobility. I mainly travel around Cape Town in two ways, either by foot or by a minibus that takes students in my program back and forth from our house to classes. It's bigger than a taxi, but smaller than a bus, and we travel along a route that takes us from OBS to campus, with some stops in between to drop students off at learning sites, which are mostly in townships. On my commutes through these townships, I've gotten plenty of time to peer into neighborhoods that I've never seen before through the tall windows of the minibus. One thing that I wrote in my mobility journal on one of these journeys was how I noticed a gradually shifting spectrum of colors in the uniforms of kids going to school. Right around 7:30 in the morning, there were hordes of children attending to their daily rhythmic walk to school, and as our minibus traversed neighborhoods, I saw kids in sweaters of green, blue, yellow, magenta, and plenty of others on their way to school. This happened every day, and it directly plays into Tim Cresswell's idea of rhythm, described in his essay Towards a Politics of Mobility as repeated moments of movement and rest. However, unlike taxis and buses, this minibus shuttle doesn't really have as many moorings, or as Dr. Bradley Rink describes in his essay, immobile infrastructure required for mobility to happen, such as bus stops or even the need to stop for people waiting for a ride. As a result, I have to wait less for other people to get on and off the minibus, and my overall experience is more smooth due to the reduction of friction. But our minibus can never fully escape friction. Even though we usually go against the rhythmic traffic flow towards downtown Cape Town in the morning, we still get held up sometimes by traffic, but that's life. An example of my transportation with even less moorings is running. The only moorings that I need are streets. To peer more deeply into my running habits, I decided to take a look at my GPS data recorded on my running watch. When looking at this heat map, a few things are obvious. First, I have a lot of runs recorded near OBS, for which the reason is pretty obvious, but also I tend to stick to main roads and trails. There have been some times when I ran as transportation as opposed to doing so just for the sake of exercise, which represents a different motivating force. As I mentioned in the introduction, the purpose of me dissecting my commute is to investigate how my mobility shapes and is shaped by who I am. As a result of the fact that this shuttle doesn't have the same need to stop for strangers, which creates for a more smooth ride, it's pretty easy for me to categorize my commute as one more similar to the level of the kinetic elite than to the mobility practices of people who reside in the townships that we drive past. And, as I mentioned earlier, I spend a lot of my time in the minibus as a spectator toward the world around me rather than a participant in it. This perfectly illustrates topics discussed in a paper by an urban and spatial development researcher, Nick Shermans, at Vrije Universiteit Brussels in Belgium. Dr. Shermans examines the particularities of encounters between mobile strangers by interviewing dozens of white residents who primarily travel around by car. As I'm sure you, as the viewer of this video, are aware, Cape Town still blatantly displays huge disparities between neighborhoods as an aftershock of apartheid. One primary goal of this research is to investigate emotions and interactions of white people on viewing their outside world. This study is almost just as much of a sociological and even historical study as it is a mobility study. He isn't just investigating modes of transportation, but the attitudes and practices held about mobility. As Dr. Sherman states, the car is generally said to insulate drivers and passengers from the social worlds they traverse. Because interactions are so dependent on proximity, an idea also considered by Dr. Rink, this demonstrates that the car acts as a social barrier in this situation. Furthermore, Sherman describes that this circumvention of interaction with poor blacks is precisely an important driver behind the hardening of socio-spatial boundaries. Basically, he describes that Cape Town isn't just divided in the spatial sense, there are psychological barriers between races manifested in attitudes and practices. While democracy was introduced roughly a quarter of a century ago, the city is still greatly segregated. Take a look at this map from 2011 and pay attention to the sharp lines of contrast between the different blocks of color. This behavior of white South Africans using cars to shield themselves from neighborhoods demonstrates the micropolitics of mobility, but how does that reveal more about my own positionality? I mean, seriously, I wrote a whole mobility journal entry about how I spend the bus ride looking at the world through a window in the comfort of a minibus, where the biggest discomfort is the occasional bounce as we go over a speed bump. Well, I don't really have a choice as to how I get to school since my program has this minibus designated for us. However, the fact that we used it in the first place at least demonstrates my privilege as a member of the kinetic elite. So I can't directly relate to my surrounding community because the extent of my interactions with Cape Town residents is the occasional wave exchange between groups of school children. However, I think that my mobility practices are different than white South Africans interviewed in the study, at least, because I do try to get out of my comfort zone. Why would I want to study abroad if I didn't want to burst out of the bubble of the familiar? So far, my favorite way of getting outside my comfort zone is running. And even if my interaction is just eye contact and a good morning spoken to people I see on the streets, that's still better than silent interactions I have through the windows of the minibus. There are plenty of neighborhoods that I still haven't run through yet, but as long as I'm healthy, I'm hoping that this heat map will only fill in more.